The night Sera Calloway walked into the wrong ballroom, she was carrying a violin case in one hand and a crumpled MapQuest printout in the other. Not a phone, an actual paper printout, because her phone had died somewhere between the parking garage and the revolving door of the Harrington Grand, and because Sera was the kind of person who still printed directions. Her mother had always said that about her. You prepare for everything except the thing that actually goes wrong. She should have been in the Magnolia Room on the second floor. That was where the Chicago Youth Orchestra was holding its winter fundraiser, the one she'd been hired to play at for $300 and a buffet dinner she'd been looking forward to all week. Instead, she pushed through a set of heavy oak doors and stepped into something else entirely. The room was enormous, chandeliers the size of small cars, white tablecloths so starched they looked carved from marble, and men, dozens of them, in suits that cost more than her rent, going completely, utterly silent the moment she walked in. Sera stopped. She looked down at her printout. Room 14B. She looked up at the brass placard beside the door. 14B. Oh no, she didn't know what kind of event this was. She didn't need to know. The silence told her everything. The particular, pressurized silence of people who were not used to being interrupted, who had the resources to make interruptions deeply unpleasant for the person responsible. A man near the door took a step toward her. Then another man put a hand on the first man's arm, and that was when Sera made the mistake of looking toward the front of the room. He was standing at the head of a long table, one hand resting flat against the surface, mid-sentence when she walked in. He was probably 35. He had the kind of face that didn't belong in a century with good lighting. All angles and shadows, jaw like something that had been decided rather than grown. Dark hair, no tie, the collar of his white shirt open exactly one button. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not anger, not amusement. Something more careful than either. "I'm so sorry," Sera said. The words came out too loud in the silence. "Wrong room. There's a fundraiser. Upstairs. I printed the wrong directions, I think, and I just..." She was backing up as she said it. Her violin case hit the doorframe. She reached behind her for the handle, found it, pushed, and got herself into the hallway before she could say anything else catastrophically embarrassing. The door swung shut behind her. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, heart hammering, then looked at the placard again. 14B. She looked at her printout. 14B. She turned the paper over. The Magnolia Room was 14B on the 3rd floor. Sera closed her eyes briefly, turned around, and walked very quickly toward the elevator. She found the fundraiser. She played the fundraiser. She ate the buffet dinner, salmon which she'd been hoping for, and she drove home in the November cold with the heat on full blast and her violin in the back seat, and the whole incident already calcifying into the kind of story she'd tell at parties. You'll never guess what I walked into. She didn't think about the man at the head of the table, or she tried not to. There was something about the way he'd looked at her. Not through her, the way people looked at musicians for hire, the human furniture of events like these. He'd looked at her, specifically, like she was a variable he was already calculating. She was a 28-year-old freelance violinist who taught lessons on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons out of a studio apartment in Wicker Park. She was not a variable anyone was calculating. She went to sleep and didn't dream about him. She woke up to a business card that had been slid under her front door. It was heavy cardstock, no logo, no title, just a name, Rourke Lane, and a phone number. On the back in handwriting that was precise and unhurried, the Harrington. Thursday, 7 p.m., I'll explain. Sera read it twice. Then she locked the deadbolt, which she realized she should have already done, because someone had been close enough to her door to slide something under it. She looked through the peephole. Empty hallway. She told herself she wasn't going. She spent Tuesday wondering who Rourke Lane was and failed to find anything useful online. No LinkedIn, no news articles, no social media. Just a name like a stone dropped into still water, with no ripple. She spent Wednesday thinking about the way he'd looked at her. Thursday at 6:45, she put on the green dress she wore to performances. The good one, not the emergency backup, and drove to the Harrington Grand. She told herself she was doing it out of curiosity. She had always been bad at leaving questions unanswered. It was, technically, a personality flaw. He was already there when she arrived, at a corner table in the hotel restaurant. No entourage, no bodyguard visible, just a glass of water and a menu he wasn't reading. He stood when he saw her. That surprised her. Men who stood when a woman approached a table were either from a different generation or performing something. He looked like neither. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "you know my name. I had someone look into the fundraiser. You were on the program." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Thank you for coming," she sat. "You could have just called. Would you have answered a number you didn't recognize?" She wouldn't have. She didn't say so. The waiter came. She ordered the pasta because she needed something to do with her hands. Rourke Lane ordered nothing, which she filed away as a detail she didn't yet understand. "You walked into a private meeting," he said, "which is not, by itself, remarkable. What was remarkable was what happened after." Sera waited. "There were 16 men in that room," he said. "When you opened the door, 11 of them reached for something under the table. You didn't notice, you just apologized." A pause. "Most people would have run. I didn't know there was anything to run from." "No," he said. "You didn't, and that told me something." She looked at him across the white tablecloth. Outside, Michigan Avenue was doing its usual Thursday night performance. Cabs, pedestrians, the orange blur of headlights. Inside, it was very quiet. "What did it tell you?" she said. "That you're either very brave or very well trained." He picked up his water glass. "I'd like to know which." Sera was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I teach violin to 8-year-olds on Tuesday afternoons. I'm neither." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "Your father was Elliot Calloway." The name landed like a stone. She hadn't heard it said out loud, casually, conversationally over pasta she hadn't touched. In 4 years. "My father died," she said, 4 years ago." "I know." He set down the glass. "I'm sorry for your loss. He was a careful man. Also a complicated one." Sera looked at him for a long moment. The restaurant hummed around them. Silverware, low conversation, the distant clatter of a kitchen. She thought about standing up and leaving. She thought about it very specifically, the mechanics of it. Push back chair, pick up clutch, walk toward exit. Don't look back. She didn't do it. "What do you want?" she said instead. "I want to know if you know what your father did," Rourke Lane said. "Not who he was to you, what he did." Elliot Calloway had been an accountant. That was the version Sera had grown up with. He worked long hours, he wore reading glasses, he was always losing. He made her mother laugh in a way that was embarrassing at dinner parties and wonderful everywhere else. He taught Sera violin when she was 4 years old. Not because he was musical, he freely admitted he wasn't, but because he believed in giving children something that was entirely their own, something no one could take away. He died of a heart attack on a Wednesday morning in March, at his desk, which was exactly where he would have wanted to go, and which somehow made it worse. After the funeral, his office was cleaned out, and his files were transferred, and his pension was administered, and the very tidy machinery of his death was processed by the firm that employed him, Whitethorn Financial, and that was that. What Rourke Lane told her over cold pasta in a hotel restaurant was different. Elliot Calloway had kept 2 sets of books for 21 years, the official ones, clean and auditable and deeply uninteresting. And the real ones, transactions, transfers, the movement of money through channels that had no legitimate explanation, for a network of people who required that kind of accounting and were willing to pay significantly for the discretion. Rourke Lane had been one of those people. "He was good," Rourke said. It sounded like genuine respect. "The best I'd worked with. He never asked questions he didn't need the answers to. He never got greedy. And he never in 21 years made a mistake. Until," Sera said, because there was clearly an until. "Until someone at Whitethorn noticed a discrepancy. A small one. The kind of thing that, if you weren't looking for it, you'd never find." But they were looking, so thought about her father at his desk, the reading glasses, the way he always hummed to himself when he was concentrating, tuneless and unconscious. Did he know they found it? He knew. He came to me 3 months before he died. Roark was quiet for a moment. He said he'd taken precautions, that if anything happened to him, the information would be protected. Protected how? Roark looked at her. Sera sat very still. She thought about the violin lessons. Not the ones she'd taught, the ones she'd received, from the time she was 4 until she was 17. Her father had hired teachers, patient women who came to the house on Saturday mornings, but before every lesson he spent 30 minutes with her himself. Just the two of them. He'd called it theory. She'd called it boring when she was little, before she stopped calling it anything at all, because it had simply become part of her life. He had taught her to read music, standard notation first, then something else. A secondary system layered underneath that he said was for really advanced musicians. She'd learned it the way children learn things they don't fully understand. By absorption, by repetition, by the slow accumulation of pattern until it became instinct. She had assumed, when she thought about it at all in adulthood, that it was a teaching method she'd never encountered elsewhere, a quirk. Her father's invention. She looked at Roark Lane across the table. The music, she said. The music, he confirmed. Her hands were completely steady in her lap. She found this faintly remarkable. He encoded it, she said. Not a question. Every transaction, every name, every account number. 21 years of records. A pause. In a notation system he taught to one person. The restaurant went on around her. Someone laughed at a table near the bar. A child at the table beside them was coloring on the paper tablecloth with a crayon, very intently, while her parents talked. "Why are you telling me this?" Sera said. "Because 3 weeks ago someone broke into your father's former office at Whitethorn," Roark said. "They didn't find what they were looking for, so now they're looking somewhere else." "He didn't say looking for you. He didn't need to." "Who?" she said. "A man named Daniel Fair. He was Whitethorn's senior auditor. He knew your father kept secondary records. He's the one who found the discrepancy. But he doesn't know the records are encoded in music. He thinks they're digital. He thinks they're stored somewhere physical." A pause. "He's been wrong so far. He's getting less patient." Sera looked at her hands. "And you want the records? I want them destroyed," Roark said. "Mine and everyone else's. That information in the wrong hands ends careers. Some of them deserve to end. Most of them don't. And in your hands—" He was quiet for a moment. "In my hands it stays buried." She looked at him for a long time. He didn't shift under the look, didn't elaborate, didn't reach for something more reassuring to say. She respected that in a detached, academic way. "I need to think," she said. "Of course." She picked up her clutch, stood. He stood too. "One question," she said. "Yes, that night when I walked into the room." She looked at him. "What did you say when the door closed? Your men started to move and then you said something." He looked at her steadily. "I said her name. Let her go." Sera held his gaze for one more second. Then she walked to the exit without looking back. She drove home with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind doing something she could only describe as reorganizing, shelves being moved, rooms being reordered. A whole floor plan, shifting to accommodate something she hadn't known was true. Her father had trusted her with the most dangerous thing he knew. He just hadn't told her. She spent 2 days with it. She pulled out her old music notebooks. She still had them, 5 composition books from childhood. Her father's handwriting in the margins alongside hers, corrections and encouragements, and the secondary notation she'd never once questioned. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and read through them, and this time she was reading differently, and what she found was staggering. Not because it was difficult to decode, because it wasn't difficult at all. She'd been carrying this for 24 years. She'd internalized it so completely that she'd thought it was just how she read music. The secondary layer was as natural to her as breathing. Names, numbers, dates, routing codes. They rose off the page like they'd always been there. Because they had, she filled 4 legal pads. Then she called Roark Lane. "I need something from you first," she said when he picked up. A brief pause. "What?" I need to know that Fair doesn't know where I live. He doesn't. Yet, then I have maybe a week. She looked at the legal pads on her table. I can give you everything, but I want guarantees. Written ones. Whatever written means in your world. I don't care what format, I just want something with your name on it that says I had no knowledge of any of this, that my father acted alone, and that when this is over, I go back to teaching violin lessons on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and no one ever contacts me again. Silence on the line. Then, that's very specific. I had 2 days to think about it. Another pause. When he spoke again, there was something different in his voice. Something careful and oddly quiet. All right, he said, I'll have something drafted. Good. She looked at her window, November light, thin and grey. And Mr. Lane? Yes, when I said I teach violin to 8-year-olds, I also have a brown belt in Krav Maga. My father made me take it. I thought it was just something he believed in. I'm starting to think it wasn't. A very long pause. No, Rourke said softly. It wasn't. They met again 2 days later, not at a restaurant, but in a private suite at the Harrington. Because the restaurant, Rourke explained, was no longer appropriate given the circumstances. 2 men she didn't know stood inside the door. Neither of them reached for anything. She gave him the legal pads. He read through them in silence while she sat in an armchair by the window and watched Michigan Avenue and thought about her father. The reading glasses, the humming, the Saturday morning sessions that had felt like homework and turned out to be something entirely different. He never told me, she thought. He made sure I could carry it without knowing I was carrying it. She didn't know yet whether to be angry about that. Maybe later, maybe when this was over and she was back in her apartment and the adrenaline had finished working its way out of her system. Maybe then. There are names here I didn't expect, Rourke said quietly without looking up. I noticed. Fair is one of them. She had noticed that too. Daniel Fair, who had been looking for the records, was himself in the records. 6 figures moving through a subsidiary so obscure it barely existed on paper. He wasn't looking to expose your father, Rourke said. He set down the legal pad. He was looking to find the evidence before anyone else could contain it. He has more to lose than most, so he's been panicking, Sera said. For 4 years. He looked at her. Since your father's heart attack, which, he stopped. The room was very quiet. Say it, she said. There are things I don't know yet, he said carefully, but the timing is one of the things I'll be looking into. Sera looked at her hands. They were steady. She noted this with a distant kind of precision, the way she noted her own reactions during difficult passages of music. Tension there, release needed here, don't rush the tempo. I want to know what you find, she said. I'll tell you. He said it simply, without qualification. Whatever I find, I'll tell you. She looked at him. There was something in his expression that she couldn't name and had been failing to name since the first night, something that was not a performance, not calculation, just a kind of directness that she found unexpectedly steadying. All right, she said. Then let's talk about Fair. They talked for 3 hours. What Sera had wasn't just names and numbers. Because she'd known the notation system from the inside, she'd also captured context. Notes her father had made alongside the entries, little observations that probably weren't meant to survive, but had been encoded into the secondary layer anyway. Fair Nervous asked twice about the subsidiary. F pushing for timeline. F doesn't know about the routing chain. A portrait of a man who'd been involved and afraid and increasingly desperate, across years of margin notes that painted a story without her father ever intending to. By the time they were done, she understood why Rourke Lane's men hadn't moved when she walked into that room. She understood what he'd said when the door closed. He'd recognized her last name. He'd calculated, in the space of a moment, that Elliot Calloway's daughter might know more than she appeared to. He'd let her walk away because she was more valuable free and unaware than contained. He'd been right. He hadn't expected to explain that to her face-to-face over cold pasta, but he'd been right. You were using me, she said. Not accusatory, just noting. I was hoping, he said. There's a difference. Not much of one. No, he agreed. Not much. She stood, picked up her coat. The documents I asked for. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. She opened it. Read it. passed it to the man near the door, who she had quietly established, over the course of 3 hours, was actually a lawyer because she had asked. She'd learned that from her father, too, probably. Ask the question that gets you the useful answer, not the polite one. The lawyer confirmed the language was enforceable. She didn't entirely believe that. She wasn't sure what enforceability meant in a world like this, but she took the document and put it in her coat pocket. "One more thing," she said. Rock waited. "My father's heart attack." She looked at him directly. "When you find out, whatever you find out, I want the chance to decide what happens to Fair." A long silence. "That's not a small thing to ask," he said. "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. "All right," he said finally. "You have my word." She believed him, which she recognized was probably irrational. She went with it anyway. She learned the truth on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Rourke sent a car. No warning, just a text that said "tonight," and she put down her grading and got in. They drove to a building she didn't know on a street she'd never had reason to be on. And Rourke met her in a room that held, among other things, Daniel Fair in a chair, looking considerably smaller than a senior auditor should. The heart attack had not been natural. Rourke told her. Then he told her what he proposed to do. His voice was flat and precise, the same voice he'd used over the legal pads, and she understood that this was the real version of the man. Not cruel, not cold, just operating in a world where clarity was more valuable than warmth. She thought about her father at his desk, humming tuneless and unconscious, the reading glasses. The way he'd put his hand on her shoulder at the end of every Saturday morning session and said, "Good work," Serafina, which was her full name and which he only used when he meant it. She thought about what she'd asked for. "I don't want what you're proposing," she said. "I want him prosecuted." She looked at Fair. "Properly. With evidence. I want it to be federal." Rourke was quiet. "I have the records," she said. "All of them. I have his name, his transactions, the notes my father made about him, across 6 years. I also have a meeting at the U.S. Attorney's office tomorrow morning, which I made before I got in your car tonight." Another silence. A longer one. "You were going to do this with or without me," Rourke said. "I was going to do it regardless of what you said tonight, yes?" She looked at him. "But I wanted to hear it from you first, and I wanted you to hear what I've decided." Daniel Fair had gone very still in the chair. Rourke looked at her for a long time. That expression again, the unnameable one which she was starting to understand, was something close to surprise, reconfiguring itself into something else. "The records include my name," he said. "My transaction." "I know. You could have handed all of it over. I could have," she said. "I didn't." He was quiet for so long that one of the men near the door shifted slightly. "Why?" Rourke said. Sera thought about it honestly. "Because my father trusted you," she said. "And my father never trusted anyone he didn't have a reason to. And because you told me the truth when you could have kept telling me half of it." She paused. "And because what I saw in those records suggests you've been cleaning up more messes than you've been making for about the last decade. So." He looked at her with that careful, unreadable look. "So," he said quietly. She picked up her coat. "I'll testify to what I know. The rest of it, the other names, the other transactions, I've redacted, selectively." She met his eyes. "I'm trusting you too. I'd appreciate it if that turned out to be earned." She walked out. The corridor outside was empty. Her heels were loud against the floor in a way that felt too loud, too much, and she made it to the elevator and pressed the button and stood with her back very straight and her hands completely still, and thought about her father, who had given her music and a brown belt in Krav Maga and an entire encrypted archive she'd been carrying inside her for 24 years. "Something that is entirely your own," he'd said when she was 4 years old. "Something no one can take away." She'd thought he meant the violin. He'd meant something larger. He'd always meant something larger. She'd just finally caught up with him. The elevator opened. She stepped in. Behind her, from somewhere down the corridor, she heard Roark's voice, low, not calling after her, just saying something to the room she'd left. She didn't catch the words. She didn't need to. She'd gotten very good over the last 2 weeks at reading what people weren't saying. The doors closed. She went home. She put on water for tea. She sat at her kitchen table with the composition books spread out in front of her. Her father's handwriting in the margins, corrections and encouragements, a whole life of careful code she'd finally learned to read, and she stayed there until the tea went cold and the city outside her window went quiet. Then she picked up her violin. She played for a long time in the dark.